He was on his way to a 7-figure meeting when he stopped in his tracks. 3 identical little boys were selling candy on the street, and what they said next made him forget everything he thought mattered. Andrew Miller didn't believe in luck, fate, or timing. He believed in numbers, clean, reliable, unflinching numbers. They had built his life, shaped his empire, and given him control in a world that constantly tried to pull emotion into decisions. That morning, like every other weekday, Andrew stepped out of the lobby of his downtown high-rise, checked the market alerts on his phone, and adjusted his blue silk tie with the ease of someone who'd worn power like a second skin for years. The driver pulled up to the curb with practiced precision, the black town car gleaming under the morning sun, but Andrew didn't climb in immediately. Just a few feet from the building's entrance, near the steps that led down to the metro, something made him stop walking. 3 small boys stood near the railing, a beat-up cardboard box between them filled with a few rows of colorful wrapped candies. They weren't shouting or pushing their product the way street kids often did. They weren't trying to guilt anyone. They just stood there quietly, offering candies to passing strangers with outstretched hands and hopeful eyes. Andrew had seen hundreds of people like this, children, teens, adults, clinging to sidewalks and curbs and subways. Usually, he never slowed. He had trained himself to move past them like you might walk around a puddle, acknowledging its presence without ever stepping into it. But this time, he paused. Something about the way the boys stood, close together, shoulder to shoulder, all roughly the same height, the same slight build, made him look twice. They looked almost identical. Triplets. Each had light brown hair that curled a little at the ends, bright blue eyes, and soft, tired expressions. They wore different colored t-shirts, red, green, and yellow, but each of them had the same jeans and worn sneakers. The boy in the green shirt met Andrew's gaze first. His voice was quiet, polite, and practiced. "Would you like to buy a candy, sir? We're trying to help our mom." Andrew glanced down at the box. The candies were simple, store-bought, assorted, some probably melting in the sun. He opened his mouth to say no, maybe offer a 10 and walk away, but something stopped him. Instead, he asked, "What's wrong with your mom?" The boy in the yellow shirt answered this time, his tone even softer. "She's sick. She has cancer. The medicine costs a lot." The third boy didn't speak. He just looked at Andrew with eyes too old for a 5-year-old, holding out a single wrapped caramel. Andrew didn't speak for several seconds. He wasn't used to pausing. He was used to immediate action, sign the deal, close the contract, move on. But in that moment, standing in front of 3 little boys selling candy on the street to try and save their mother, he felt a kind of stillness he hadn't felt in years. Without saying a word, he pulled out his wallet and bought every piece of candy in the box. He should have left then, should have climbed into his waiting car and forgotten about it by the time he reached his office. But instead, he sat down on the nearby bench, ignoring the surprised glance from his driver, and gestured for the boys to sit beside him. They hesitated, unsure if this was a trick or a test, but eventually sat, one on each side and one at his feet. "What are your names?" he asked. "Noah," said the boy in red. "Ben," said the one in yellow. "Lucas," said the one in green. Andrew nodded slowly, then asked the question that changed everything. "Where's your mom now?" And that was how the story began, not with profit or loss, not with a merger or a press release, but with 3 boys and a box of candy, and a man who finally stopped to ask a question that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with being human. The boys didn't answer right away. They looked at each other the way siblings do when they're silently deciding who will speak. It was Ben, the one in yellow, who finally spoke up. He said their mom, Ashley, was at Cityview Medical Center and had been there for over a month. She'd been diagnosed with a fast-growing cancer, and though she'd tried to keep working for as long as possible, her health had quickly declined. They said she collapsed in their apartment and was taken by ambulance while a neighbor watched them. Since then, she hadn't been home. Lucas added that she used to sing every night before bed, but now they just listen to the silence and hope she remembers them when she wakes up. That was the part that made Andrew's chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. They weren't just trying to help their mom, they were trying to hold on to her memory. He asked them who they were living with, and they explained that a kind older neighbor named Mrs. Delaney had let them stay on a pull-out couch in her living room, but she didn't have much money or food. The boys didn't want to be a burden. They didn't want to be separated or sent away. So, every day after breakfast, if there was breakfast, they packed their candy box and came downtown, hoping people would be generous enough to help them save their mom. Andrew didn't know what to say. He had sat in boardrooms with billionaires who bragged about outsmarting the tax system and cutting medical costs from employee plans. And now he was listening to 3 5-year-old boys trying to fund chemotherapy by selling 25-cent candies to strangers. Without thinking, he took out his phone and sent a message to his assistant, canceling the morning's meetings. Then he typed a second text to a friend of his who sat on the board of Cityview Medical and requested full details on a patient named Ashley Reeves. The reply came back quickly: yes, she was there, yes, her diagnosis was serious, and no, she wasn't receiving full treatment because she had no insurance and no upfront funding. Andrew read those words twice, barely able to process how someone so vulnerable could be so invisible in a system built to ignore anything it couldn't monetize. He looked down at the boys, who were now quietly sorting the empty candy wrappers back into the box, probably out of habit, probably to make the box look fuller for tomorrow. "Come with me," he said, rising to his feet. "Where?" Noah asked, squinting up at him. "To see your mom," Andrew replied. "And then home. I want to meet Mrs. Delaney." The boys exchanged glances again, and this time, they didn't hesitate. They gathered their things and followed him to the car. The drive to the hospital was quiet at first. The boys sat close together in the back seat, eyes wide as they stared at the city from a view they rarely saw. Andrew sat in the front, phone in his lap, not checking it. He didn't want distractions. He wanted to understand the world they came from, the gaps between the numbers he'd always trusted. At the hospital, a nurse confirmed Ashley's condition and escorted them to her room. The boys froze in the doorway when they saw her. She was pale, thinner than they remembered, with 4 lines tracing her arms and soft beeps tracking her breath. But her eyes opened when she heard their voices. She smiled weakly and reached out to them. They rushed to her side. No words were needed. It was the reunion of a family who had no guarantees and no promises, only hope. Andrew stood back, watching, something in his chest tightening with every second. He had never known what it meant to be needed without being asked. Until now. And when Ashley looked at him, confused and grateful all at once, he knew this was no longer about charity or chance. It was about stepping into a story he had almost walked past. And finally choosing to stay. The hospital room was small, quiet, and filled with the kind of sterile stillness that made people whisper without realizing it. Andrew stood near the door while the boys gathered around their mother's bed, one on each side and one curled gently at the foot. Ashley looked tired, her skin pale and her eyes framed with deep shadows, but when she smiled, something softened the entire room. She held each of her son's hands like they were lifelines, and for a long time, none of them spoke. They just stayed close, as if to prove they were still real to one another. Andrew didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions or try to insert himself. He simply observed, arms folded loosely, taking in every second of a family trying to stay whole in a world that had already taken too much. After a while, Ashley turned to look at him. Her voice was faint but steady. She thanked him for bringing the boys and asked who he was. Andrew stepped forward and introduced himself without any pretense. He didn't mention his company, his title, or his wealth. He simply said his name, explained that he had met the boys downtown, and that he hadn't been able to walk away once he heard why they were there. She listened closely, her brow slightly furrowed, and when he finished, she nodded slowly, as if trying to hold her judgment until she could think more clearly. "I didn't want this for them," she said, voice cracking. "I didn't want them out there like that." Andrew shook his head. "They weren't just surviving. They were fighting for you. You should be proud of that." The words made her eyes well up with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, not wanting her sons to see. She asked where they had been sleeping and if they'd eaten. The boys chimed in all at once, eager to reassure her. Andrew filled in the blanks where they hesitated, letting her know that Mrs. Delaney had taken good care of them, and that he'd like to help her too. He told her he'd already looked into her medical case, and that he wanted to make sure she received every treatment available, starting immediately. Ashley didn't speak right away. She simply stared at him for a long moment, unsure whether to trust this stranger who had appeared so suddenly. Then she asked one question: "Why are you doing this?" Andrew had anticipated that, but still struggled to answer. He looked at the boys, then back at her. "Because I've spent most of my life counting money, and today I realized I've never counted something that really matters. Your sons reminded me what matters." For the first time since he arrived, Ashley smiled without pain behind it. She closed her eyes briefly, exhaled, and whispered, "Then I guess it's okay to say yes." Andrew spent the rest of the afternoon with them. He arranged for a financial transfer to cover the cost of Ashley's full treatment plan, met with the attending physician to authorize procedures, and contacted a trusted caregiver agency to support the family until Ashley could stand again. When they left the hospital that evening, he drove the boys back to Mrs. Delaney's apartment. It was a small space with peeling paint and a leaky faucet in the kitchen, but it was filled with warmth. Mrs. Delaney, a retired schoolteacher, greeted them at the door with a cautious smile and a slight limp. She clearly cared for the boys, but the burden had taken a toll on her. Andrew introduced himself, thanked her sincerely for everything she had done, and offered to cover her rent and expenses until Ashley was home again. She resisted at first, embarrassed by the gesture, but he insisted gently, saying she had kept a family together when no one else would. That night, before leaving, Andrew knelt in front of the boys, looked them in the eyes, and promised them that they wouldn't have to sell candy on the street again. He didn't know what kind of future they'd have yet, but he would help them build it. As he drove home, the city outside his car window looked the same: busy sidewalks, flashing lights, honking horns. But nothing felt the same. He wasn't thinking about deals or markets or deadlines. He was thinking about 3 small boys, a tired mother, and a moment that had rewritten everything he thought he understood about value. Something had shifted. And there was no going back. The next morning, Andrew woke up earlier than usual. He didn't reach for his phone to check emails or scan market updates. Instead, he sat in the quiet of his high-rise apartment and thought about the boys, how they had sat beside their mother without needing to say anything, how Lucas had rested his head gently on her arm, how Noah had instinctively watched her breathing as if measuring each moment. He had seen desperation in people before, mostly in boardrooms disguised as ambition, but never in children. The calm way they faced their world, their small shoulders already carrying too much, stayed with him like a weight he didn't want to let go. He spent the morning arranging more permanent care. He called a pediatric counselor he trusted and set up sessions for the boys to begin working through the trauma they had clearly learned to mask. He had meals delivered to Mrs. Delaney's apartment, along with a note thanking her again. He made a list of schools in nearby neighborhoods with strong academic and emotional support programs, determined to give the boys more than just comfort. He wanted them to have a future. Not out of guilt or pity, but because something about their quiet resilience had cracked open a part of him he didn't know was still alive. Later that day, he returned to the hospital. Ashley was sitting up this time, her skin still pale but her eyes clearer. She looked stronger, as though just seeing her boys had restored something inside her that medicine couldn't. They talked more easily now, no longer separated by caution or discomfort. She told him stories about the boys when they were toddlers, how they used to sneak into her bed all at once and pretend to be kittens. She laughed when she said it, and Andrew couldn't help but smile too. He noticed the way her hand twitched slightly when she reached for water and made a mental note to have an occupational therapist consult. He was learning to see things differently, not just as needs to solve, but as parts of people's lives worth protecting. As they spoke, a nurse came in and quietly handed Ashley a file. Her treatment schedule had been confirmed. Everything was covered. She opened it slowly, scanning the pages with trembling fingers. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they didn't fall. "You really did all of this?" she asked. Andrew nodded. "And I'll keep doing it. As long as it takes." She stared at him for a long moment, then said, "You don't owe us anything." He didn't argue. He just answered with, "I know. That's why it matters." That afternoon, he picked up the boys and brought them to a small children's bookstore he had once passed but never entered. They spent over an hour browsing. Ben found a book about planets, Lucas chose a picture book about animals that sing, and Noah stood frozen in front of a shelf of superhero stories. Andrew bought all three, along with notebooks and colored pencils. When they stepped outside into the cool breeze, the boys held the bags close like treasure. "You didn't have to do that," Noah said, his voice barely above a whisper. Andrew looked at him and replied, "I wanted to." "That's different." Before taking them home, he stopped by a small park and let them run. It was the first time he saw them play without hesitation, without fear of being watched or judged. They raced across the grass, climbed the jungle gym, and shouted challenges at one another as the sky turned gold above them. Andrew sat on a bench, watching with a strange ache in his chest. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt like someone who had been given the rare chance to witness healing begin. When he dropped them off that evening, Mrs. Delaney opened the door with a tired but genuine smile. The boys hugged him without being prompted, and Andrew left with the sound of their laughter still echoing behind him. Driving back through the city lights, he realized something had changed, not in the boys, or Ashley, or their circumstance, but in him. For the first time in years, he was no longer chasing numbers. He was beginning to follow meaning. A week passed, and each day brought subtle but steady change. Ashley's strength began to return, not in dramatic bursts, but in the way she stayed awake longer, sat up straighter, and asked more questions about her boys' routines. Andrew visited daily without being asked. At first, he brought updates about their schedules, meals, and the progress of school enrollment, but gradually, their conversations drifted into something more personal. She told him about her years working as a freelance photographer before her illness, about how she used to sneak the boys out for sunrise photo walks before the city woke up. He listened, not with polite nods or vague interest, but with real attention, as if each story helped him understand more about the people he was now choosing to care for. The boys, in the meantime, had shifted too. They still stuck close to one another in public, still kept their backpacks zipped tightly like armor, but their eyes were brighter. They laughed more often and slept more soundly. At the end of each day, they would report to Andrew with unfiltered honesty. Lucas told him when the school forms were confusing, Ben confessed he didn't like tuna sandwiches, and Noah asked him if he'd ever had to sit alone at lunch. Andrew didn't always know how to answer, but he never dismissed their words. That seemed to be what mattered most. One rainy Thursday, the hospital called Andrew in the middle of a finance meeting. Ashley had asked for him. He excused himself without hesitation and arrived to find her sitting upright in bed, wearing a soft head wrap and an expression that held both resolve and vulnerability. The nurses had told her the next round of treatment would be harder. She wanted to prepare the boys but didn't know how. She asked if he would be there when she told them. He said yes before she finished the sentence. That evening, in the hospital room dimmed by fading daylight, Ashley took each boy's hand and explained what was coming. She didn't sugarcoat it, but she didn't scare them either. She said her hair might fall out again and there would be days she couldn't talk much, but she would still be their mom. They were quiet at first. Then Lucas asked if she'd still be able to sing. She smiled and said only if they sang with her. And in that small, worn room, the three boys softly hummed a lullaby they remembered from before the hospital, their voices wavering but united. Andrew stood by the door, his throat tight, not daring to interrupt. Later that night, Ashley asked Andrew to sit with her. The boys had gone home with Mrs. Delaney and a warm meal. The hospital room was quiet except for the faint hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of nurses in the hallway. She looked at him and said, "I thought I was doing okay. But I see now, I was just surviving. You helped me give them back something I couldn't find alone, safety." Andrew didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't used to hearing himself described as anything more than efficient, decisive, or shrewd. But Ashley wasn't trying to flatter him. She was simply stating something true. Before he left, she reached for his hand. "If anything happens to me," she said, her voice low but clear, "don't let them be alone. Please." He looked her in the eye and said, "They won't be. I promise." And for the first time in a very long time, he meant it with everything he had. When he walked out of the hospital into the rain, his shoulders were soaked within seconds, but he didn't rush to cover himself. He let it fall over him like a kind of cleansing, like the world reminding him he was no longer just an observer. He was part of something real now, something worth standing in the storm for. By the second week of Ashley's new treatment cycle, the boys had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt almost like normal life. Each morning, Andrew picked them up from Mrs. Delaney's apartment and drove them to their new school, a small community-based academy that welcomed them with gentle structure and compassion. At first, they clung to one another even during recess, wary of separating after so many weeks of survival mode, but little by little, they began branching out. Lucas joined the art club and came home with colorful smudges on his sleeves. Ben became fascinated with math and asked Andrew to quiz him on multiplication tables in the car. Noah, ever the quiet observer, started writing short journal entries his teacher encouraged, and when Andrew read one that ended with the words, "Maybe I'm not scared all the time anymore," he didn't speak for a long time. Back at the hospital, Ashley's body was enduring the weight of the new treatment, but her spirit remained determined. There were days she could barely keep her eyes open, when her voice was no more than a whisper, but she still asked about her sons every time Andrew visited. She wanted to know what they were learning, how they were sleeping, whether they were eating enough, if they had new friends. She asked for every detail like a woman building her strength not through medicine, but through memory and connection. Andrew brought her updates like offerings, photographs of Lucas's latest drawings, Ben's perfect quiz scores, and the poem Noah had written about how rain reminded him of his mom humming. She would smile and hold the photos close, sometimes asking to hear the words twice just to make sure she remembered them when she closed her eyes. One afternoon, Andrew arrived at the hospital with a surprise. He had asked the school's music teacher to record a short video of the boys performing a small piece they'd learned together. The three of them stood side by side in the video, singing slightly off-key but with so much heart that Ashley cried before the song even ended. She asked to play it again. And again. The nurses who passed the room paused when they heard the soft singing, lingering with smiles before moving on. That night, after Ashley fell asleep, Andrew sat in the hallway just outside her door, the video still playing softly on repeat in his hand. The next day, he took the boys to a weekend fair held at a park downtown. There were colorful tents, food trucks, and a small petting zoo tucked behind the bandstand. The boys ran ahead, laughing and calling out to each other, a blur of energy and joy Andrew had once thought impossible for them. He watched them closely but didn't hover. He allowed himself to relax, to enjoy it, even buying cotton candy they swore tasted like clouds. At one point, Lucas tugged on his sleeve and pointed at a booth where kids were decorating flower pots. They each made one, painting the clay in messy streaks of blue and green and orange. On Noah's pot, he wrote one word in black paint, family. Andrew helped them carry the flower pots back to the hospital the following day. Ashley had been moved to a private recovery room, a small step forward, and when she saw what the boys had made, she laughed through her exhaustion. "We're planting roots," she said quietly, and Andrew felt the full meaning of her words settle inside him like something permanent. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to grow again. That night, the boys fell asleep on the couch at Mrs. Delaney's while watching a movie. Andrew stayed longer than usual, helping clean up the dinner dishes, tucking the blankets around the boys, and sitting quietly beside them while they slept. Mrs. Delaney sat in her armchair, watching him with a small, knowing smile. "You're part of their story now," she said gently. Andrew nodded, unable to put into words how much that meant to him. He hadn't asked for it. He hadn't expected it. But somehow, in a matter of weeks, he had become something to these boys, and they had become everything to him. By the end of the third week, the house that once felt like a hotel suite filled with borrowed time had begun to take on the warmth of something permanent. It wasn't the furniture or the walls or the carefully chosen rugs Andrew had installed, it was the laughter that spilled through the hallways after dinner, the half-drawn crayon pictures taped to the fridge, and the 3 sets of little shoes left in a heap by the door. The boys had finally started calling it home, even if they didn't say the word out loud. Every morning they woke up with a little more ease, and every night they fell asleep without clinging to each other quite so tightly. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had softened, replaced slowly by routine, by safety, and by the growing presence of a man who no longer stood in the background. Ashley had begun her final and most intense round of chemotherapy. The doctors were cautious, explaining the risks and the pain that would come, but Ashley insisted on continuing. She said she didn't want her children to remember her giving up. Andrew was there every day, bringing her soup she couldn't always finish, holding her hand through the fatigue, and reading aloud when her eyes refused to focus. They spoke less during those visits, not because there was nothing to say, but because sometimes presence itself spoke louder than comfort. He knew when to stay silent, when to offer a smile, when to simply be near. And she trusted that silence more than any promise. One evening, as he sat beside her bed while the boys waited outside with coloring books, Ashley looked at him with a strange stillness in her eyes. She asked him, softly but directly, if he had ever thought of being a father. The question caught him off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because of how much it hurt to realize he had never allowed himself to even imagine it. He answered truthfully, saying he thought he wasn't built for that kind of life, that he believed people like him didn't get to have children because they would never know how to love them right. Ashley listened without judgment, her expression soft and steady. She reached for his hand and told him that it wasn't about being right, it was about showing up. And he had shown up. Later that week, she asked him to bring the boys with him to the hospital for something important. When they arrived, she had each of them sit on her bed, and she gave them tiny paper envelopes with their names written in shaky handwriting. Inside each one was a photo, of her holding them as infants, a memory they wouldn't remember but could carry. Then she asked Andrew to stand by the window and said, "This man is not just helping us. He's ours now. And we are his." The boys looked at her, then at him, and didn't question it. They got off the bed and walked over to him. One by one, they wrapped their arms around his waist. He dropped to his knees without hesitation and held them all. Ashley watched with tears in her eyes. She didn't speak again for a long time. That night, as Andrew drove the boys home, they fell asleep in the back seat, one resting on the other. He parked the car and didn't move, letting them sleep just a little longer. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but his heart was somewhere else, back in the hospital room, in the moment she had looked at him and seen something he hadn't seen in himself. Not a businessman. Not a helper. A father. The word echoed through him as if it had been waiting for years to be spoken. And now, with everything in him, he wanted to live up to it. The morning Ashley was released from the hospital, the sky was a clear, calm blue, the kind of sky that almost felt symbolic. Andrew arrived early, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he couldn't stay away. He helped the nurses gather her things, just a small bag, a worn sweater, a few books she hadn't had the energy to finish. When Ashley stepped into the sun for the first time in weeks, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, her body still fragile but her presence steady. Andrew stood beside her without speaking, and when she looked at him, there was no need for thank yous. Everything had already been said in the quiet hours between treatment and recovery, between strangers and something closer. He brought her home in his car, the same one that had carried her boys to school and appointments and ice cream stops. When they pulled into the driveway of the house he had purchased not for himself, but for all of them, the boys were waiting on the porch. Lucas had made a welcome sign that was crooked and colorful. Ben had balloons he had insisted on inflating himself, and Noah stood a little apart, holding a flower pot they had all planted together weeks earlier. The moment Ashley stepped out of the car, they rushed toward her, carefully, gently, but with so much joy it made her knees buckle. She dropped to them, letting them wrap around her, their small arms and voices tangling into something whole. That night, they sat around a dinner table that had been too quiet for too long. Mrs. Delaney came, and so did the school counselor and one of Ashley's old friends from her photography days. There was soup and bread and too many desserts, and Andrew found himself laughing more freely than he had in years. The boys took turns telling stories about their favorite parts of the past few months, and Lucas said his favorite thing was having a grown-up who stays even when it's hard. Ashley glanced at Andrew when he said it, and Andrew looked back with a quiet smile that said he wasn't going anywhere. After the dishes were cleared and the guests left, the house dimmed into evening light. Ashley tucked the boys into their new bunk beds, reading from a worn book that had survived every hospital trip and every move. Andrew stood in the hallway, watching from the doorway. He had never imagined himself in this kind of life, yet every corner of the home felt more his than any boardroom ever had. When Ashley came out of the room, she leaned against the wall beside him. They didn't speak at first, just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the soft breathing of the children on the other side of the door. Then she turned to him and asked softly, "Do you still think you're not meant for this?" He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was steady. "I think I was meant for it all along. I just didn't know how to find it." She reached for his hand and held it without saying anything else. In the quiet, he thought about how much had changed, not in a dramatic way, but piece by piece, one choice at a time. A decision to stop, to ask, to stay. Later, when the house had settled and the night was deep, Andrew stepped outside onto the porch. The stars were out, clear and endless. He thought about all the years he had lived with noise in his head and silence in his heart, chasing numbers and titles, always moving, never arriving. And now here he was, with a family he hadn't expected and a purpose that had nothing to do with profit. He had found something that didn't need to be measured to be real. He had found love, in the quiet resilience of a mother, in the laughter of 3 little boys, and in the choice to be more than a man who walked past. He chose to be someone who stayed. And in that choice, everything changed.